let's take a look at how we can now turn this into a more object-oriented solution to this problem. So when we're thinking about this particular programming problem, the best thing to do is think about what is the data that we need to deal with. What are the things? What are the objects? What are the items? In this case, very literally, the items that we're dealing with. So let's think of this, instead of thinking of a list of names, a list of descriptions, and a list of prices, let's think of it as a list of items. And we'll actually create a definition for an item and then make an array of items, and each item will hold on to the data that it needs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new class for this particular program, and I'm going to call it a menu item. What is the data that an item has? Well, we've declared it over here. It's going to have a name, a description, a price, and some indication of whether or not it's gluten-free. So over here, let's create that data. So I can now take out the prefix menu item from these variable names because these are variables that are contained inside the menu item. So instead of calling something menu item name or menu item description or menu item price, I've got a thing called a menu item, and it has a name, a description, a price, and an indicator of whether or not it's gluten-free. Now, it may not be very clear how we would use this, but when we create a class to represent a particular kind of data, what we're doing is we are actually creating a variable type, just like a string or a double or a Boolean. So now, instead of having a situation where I have multiple parallel arrays, what I'm going to do instead is create a single array that's made up of menu items. So a menu item array, and I'll call it the menu. And what it is a new array of 5 menu items. So now I don't need any of these variables. I have a list of menu items. Now obviously this is going to cause kind of a cascade of errors throughout my code, but that's okay. We'll deal with that in a second. So I've created an array of 5 menu items. What I've really done is created an array that can hold 5 menu items, but I don't actually have the menu items yet. So what I need to do is I need to actually create each new menu item. So menu is the name of my variable that holds the array of menu items. So menu 0 is going to be equal to a new menu item. And this is how we create an object. This line right here is very important. This line number 17. What I'm doing is, inside my array, I'm going to take the first element and make it equal to a new menu item. Okay, so this creates what we call an instance of a menu item. It creates that item. This line up here, you may think, well, hey, didn't I just create 5 menu items? Well, no, what you actually did here was you created an array that was capable of holding 5 menu items. But you didn't actually create each individual one. So you created the space to hold them. Here, we actually create the item in each space. So let's watch how I can get rid of these errors now. So instead of setting menu item name 0 to that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the menu item at element 0. I'm going to hit the period, the dot, and you'll see what happens is a list of what we would call members for that item appear. So up here I've got a description. You can see all the variables that I created show up here. Well, I want to set the name, so I'm just going to double click on the name. And now what I've done is I've taken this menu item's name and set it equal to salt and pepper chicken wings. The same way I can take the menu dot. Now I can also just start typing. So if I want to set the description, you'll see that it quickly jumps to that. And if I hit enter, this is a really quick and easy way of being able to access the different members. The other value in doing this is I don't have to remember to correctly type all of this. If I just remember that I want to deal with menu item 0, basically the first element in that array, when I hit the dot, it will give me a list of matching elements, and so I can really avoid a lot of typos there. So what I've done here is I've set up the first element in the array as a new menu item, and I've set all of its properties, or we sometimes call these attributes, or we sometimes call them member variables. There's a lot of different names for these things. Basically, they're just the data that we've set up inside of this menu item class. So now all I'm going to do is set this up for all of the remaining items, and then we'll take a look at why this is a better way to do things. So here I've finished refactoring the code, and if you haven't heard that term before, refactoring basically means changing the code so that it's cleaner or somehow improved, but it does exactly the same thing. So we're not adding features, we're not changing functionality, we're just making the code more efficient. So I've gone in there and I've changed up defining my menu items. I still need to go in here and make a couple of edits into how I'm referring to the menu items themselves. So you can see that this is a little tricky to go in and replace all of your references to the original variables to the references to the new object member fields. And just in terms of jargon, just so you understand, this menu I, this is in the menu array, the element at position I, which is going to be a number from 0 to 5, or 0 to 4 in this case. This is referring to a member in the array, and it's an object. So this menu item class that we created, this is a class that is used to create objects. And a class just is basically a very complicated variable definition, where a variable can have sort of sub-variables, which we call members, and it can actually have methods in it too, and we'll get to that in a moment. So back here, I've finally finished refactoring this, and what you'll notice is that if we run it, it looks exactly the same. Nothing has changed at all here. So if you look at this, if we want to make things a little more, efficient, one thing that's good to do is to take a look and make sure that you can see commonalities. And one thing you can notice is that before we set up each menu item, we have to make a new menu item in that spot. Right, so that's one of the things that we're doing over and over and over again here. You can see on line 35, and again down here on line 41. So we have 5 lines of code creating the new menu items. A quicker way to do that would be to define all of those menu items inside a loop. And there's a little shortcut you can use. For I, and then hit tab, and you will get a for loop that has a built-in variable as a counter. And you'll notice here it does a really neat thing. It actually uses the variable, the array variable that I declared in the previous line as the length. This is something that happens so often where you declare an array and then you want to do something with it, that NetBeans is smart enough to know that. But it doesn't know what to do inside the loop. So here, what we have to do is we have to change this and say, well, let's make menu I equal to a new menu item. Okay, so now we do all this in a loop, and that means I can get rid of 5 lines of code later on in my program, replacing them with basically 2 lines of code, 3 if you count that last brace. So that makes things a little more efficient. You may be just taking my word for it that this is a better way to do things because I've said so. Really, this helps us to organize our data inside of an object, so we don't have a whole bunch of arrays being handled here in the main method. There's also the ability to put some actual functionality into this class, and that's really the big superpower of classes. And let's take a look at one way we could do this. Right now you can see here that when we print out the menu, we're actually doing a lot of work here printing out all of these member variables inside the main method. So the main method really requires to have some knowledge of what's going on inside the class. We're independently accessing all of these different member variables. It'd be nice if we could just tell the menu item to print itself out. So let's take a look at how we could do that. We can give our menu item methods. And so let's give our menu item its own print method. And what we can do is just move this information inside here. The main difference is that I was referencing a particular array member outside of this class, because in the main I was trying to access these variables. Inside of a class, what's assumed is that the class is going to be accessing its own variables. So I don't have to specify a particular variable name anymore, because the class is going to assume you're talking about its own name variable or its own description or its own price or gluten-free indicator. And that's because we've defined these variables up here. So it's going to look to these. So now our menu item class has a print method that any object that we create from this class will have access to this print method. So what that means is now, if I want, I can go back in here, and for each menu item, I can simply call its print method, which now shows up in the list of things it can do. So instead of the main class having to worry about having all this extra code in here, we can just say, go grab the menu item and call its print method. And so now when I run this, again, we've refactored it. It looks exactly the same, but what we've done is we've pushed some of the work down to the class. So it's not in the main method. The main method doesn't need to know about it. All it needs to know is that it can call that object's print method, but it doesn't need to know all the details. So this is a much simpler program now. If we look at this, this is a much simpler program than it was a little while ago. Okay, we've got some data that we define, and we print out our menu. Okay, very simple. And we've pushed all of the data storage and all the interaction with the data to a certain degree, the printing of the data, back to the menu item class itself. This is the simplest implementation of object-oriented programming. It's just this idea of taking the data related to an object and some of the actions related to the object and pushing it back, storing it all together in one place, so that there's one definition of the data and the methods, or the information and the actions that surround a particular kind of an object. And we'll see lots of examples as the course goes on of other kinds of objects that have more actions or more data. And so that's it. That's a really simple overview of going from a procedural implementation to an object-oriented implementation of this problem.